In Finland, we tend to trust people as the kind of starting point. If I pick my favorite Nordic country, I have to say it's actually not Finland, it's Norway.
That's the only time I've had a lot of Finnish people approach me and start conversations.
So I do think there's we're a society built on rules and regulations. And when you follow them, things kind of work out. Then, flexibility really isn't the strong side of the different governmental agencies. I think it's quite clear how Finland has been kind of a closed society, not, through law and regulation, but culturally.
I think that's holding Finland back a bit is how much Finnish education and work experience is valued more than experience in education abroad. There was some study around this that I think around 50% of students that would want to stay end up leaving. Hello everyone, my name's Matthews Joy. This is Joy of Finland, and this is our second episode with Johanna Småros. So a little bit about me initially. I am originally from India, grew up pretty globally, around the world, mostly in Canada. Then I was an exchange student here in Finland, had a really good time, and decided to come back for a master's, and realized Finland is my favorite country that I've lived in. And now I've been working in startups here and been part of the startup ecosystem and trying to learn more about what are the strengths and areas of improvement in Finland, particularly from the perspective of tech entrepreneurs like Johanna. So maybe to give a very short intro to Johanna, she started off as a researcher in retail supply chain and then eventually became a SaaS Co-founder of RELEX Solutions. They most recently raised a $500 million funding round from Blackstone Growth. I believe that's the largest funding round in Finland, but correct me if I'm wrong. But yes, without further ado, Johanna, why don't you tell the listeners of Joy of Finland a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Basically, I'm the most boring person on earth, so there's not too much to add to that introduction, I'm afraid.
Well, fair enough. I think when we dive deeper, I would agree to disagree on that. So first and foremost, I think it's a very hot topic these days. I'm part of Slush, and the core issue, I think, with a lot of researchers now is potentially making that transition to business. I do believe there's a lot of value in research, but it can be pigeonholed in a very niche audience, and it's not accessible to a bigger audience and not able to make the true impact that it could. And I believe this is where tech and entrepreneurship can come into play. So what was the transition like for you going from researcher to founder, and what made you want to do that?
Firstly, it wasn't that big a step for us. And I think one reason is that, there's lots of different types of research, and we did applied research. So already as researchers, we worked together with a lot of partner companies with the aim of improving things. So not just studying how things are done, but also trying to figure out how through different types of interventions we could, for example, improve efficiency. And that's also why I stopped being a researcher, because I really wanted to improve things. And it felt like research was actually a fairly slow vehicle of achieving that, at least in our field. So we felt that we had all these great ideas, but we also saw that it was a long path to actually seeing these being implemented, beyond a kind of small pilot run temporarily using spreadsheets. So companies actually needed quite a bit more advanced system to take advantage of what we were developing. So it started feeling that we were kind of adding more research papers to an ever-growing pile of papers. And that, could have pursued an academic career, and we kind of got a lot of those accomplishments done, but it didn't feel all that meaningful. So then we felt that, well, maybe we should just take some of these ideas and see if we can make them into something real. And that's the path we are on still.
Yes, it seems like a long journey. That's been very meaningful. When was the transition exactly when you started RELEX? Was it 2005?
Yeah, so in 2005, myself and our CEO, Mikko, defended our dissertations pretty much at the same time in August. And then we started thinking about the next step, because up till then we were kind of married to doing that thesis, because when you've started, you might as well finish it. And then we started talking about what to do next. And it was actually Mikko who suggested that, maybe we should start our own business. And I had actually not even seen that as an opportunity. I was looking at, getting kind of maybe a real job in a corporation, or maybe go into consulting, something like that. But then Mikko started talking about entrepreneurship. And then I felt like, well, I don't have anything to lose. At that time, I was still young and beautiful. I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. So it was like, what's the worst thing that can happen? I'll spend some time without being paid a salary, and then I'll get a real job. So it felt like it was a fairly small step with a huge advantage of being able to work with smart people like Mikko. And then Michael, who we also recruited from the research group, and effectively destroyed his academic career because he was just starting on his PhD studies, and so far hasn't finished them, but there's still time.
Sure. I would have two follow-up questions, and I will try not to plug Slush too much. I work at Slush, but like I said, part of what we want to do is encourage more people to do entrepreneurship. As I've understood, when Slush was founded around the late 2000s, this was very topical that most people want to go into consulting or big companies. And I would say, seeing quite a big shift nowadays. Would you say that you were an early adopter of this shift to entrepreneurship, or was that scary? I guess you said you have nothing to lose, but was there any pushback from anyone in your circles or anything like that?
I don't think my circles care about what I do professionally. So no pushback, but also there wasn't like this startup hype. So it was kind of a bit of an unusual path to take. So in industrial management, which is what I've been, studying and then doing my research in, the normal path was to either go into consultancy or work for one of these big corporations. So back in the day, it was a bit unique. But I've never been too concerned about what other people think. It's more important for me to feel that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah, sure. I think that's maybe something I've struggled with when I was younger, and something I've evolved, and something I'll expand on in a little bit, because I think you have some very relevant experience. But before that, I like the wording when you said, was it for Michael, bringing him on board and destroying his research. Do you think, what's your take on researchers today? Maybe it's different with applied research or other kinds of research. When does it make sense for someone to stay in research versus going to industry and solving the problem directly? Or then maybe more clearly put, what is your advice to researchers today in terms of maybe taking something that they're doing now?
Well, first of all, I hate giving advice. I don't feel I'm qualified to give other people advice on how they should lead their life. And also, I think more importantly, there's so many different types of research. And I definitely don't want to give the impression that it wouldn't be valuable to do research. But I also think that you need to kind of examine your own motivations. So why are you doing things? Do you get satisfaction out of what you're doing? Because I quite enjoyed doing research. There's a lot of advantages to doing that. So for example, really having time to dig deep into a problem that you are super curious about. That's a very luxurious position to be in. But then on the other hand, I wasn't satisfied with the outcomes of what I was doing. So I didn't feel that it was all that meaningful. So the work was nice, but then the impact was not super motivating. So I think it's important to understand your own motivations and then make decisions based on those. And those can change over time. So as said, I was quite happy doing research until I wasn't happy anymore.
Very well put, and interesting how you said you're maybe not in a position to give advice, but if I'm looking at that advice as an outsider, I would say that's very helpful to anyone and very applicable. Something that you touched on earlier that I would like to expand on a bit is how there wasn't the startup hype, especially when you started. And I think we've discussed previously that you're not maybe your typical startup founder, or that's not, RELEX doesn't fit that mold. Maybe you could speak on that a little bit. What is the typical startup hype and how you don't fit in there?
Yeah, again, startup hype comes with a lot of good things. So, for example, putting entrepreneurship on the map as an alternative. So, as said, for me, it wasn't on the map until Mikko put it there. So, without him, I would probably never kind of even thought about this option. But then there's some negatives. So, for example, I do think that there's a lot of emphasis on, for example, scaling. It's always seen as a big plus if you're able to scale really fast. And that can take the eye off the ball in a sense that you don't care enough about, for example, making sure that you actually have a profitable business model, you take care of the people you involve, you take care of your clients, and kind of have a long-term solid foundation. And there's also a lot of attention on who's raising money and how much and at what stage. And I think sometimes we forget that investment money is, again, just a vehicle to achieve some other goals. So the goal really isn't to collect as much investor funding as you can and then feel that you're successful when you manage to do that. The goal needs to be something else, for example, solving a very interesting problem.
Yes, I think, especially now, what you described in terms of the goal of getting investor funding, I think that worked maybe for a long time up until recently, given the market cycles. But I think even more so now that's even more important, as you can't just try to grow at all costs, and you have to be more strategic, I would say. Then one thing that you touched on before is not caring too much about what other people think and more deciding on what you want to do just based on what you want to do yourself. And when I think about myself, that was typically very challenging for me, but something that helped me a lot was doing sales. So cold calling a lot in my first startup job, and somehow for me, I had to let go of that very quickly because facing a lot of rejection, and before that would really bring me down initially, but then I got over that. And what I wanted to ask you about is, I think you've described yourself as an introverted engineer initially, and how you got more confidence in your career, and then eventually leading to cold calling your way to RELEX's expansion. So could you talk a little bit about that journey? Because at least for me, being introverted to go into sales was really tough. But how was that for you?
Yeah, so I'm still introverted. I need a lot of time on my own. I can come across as extroverted, but that takes a lot of energy. So I think the definition is that do you kind of feel energized after engaging with other people, or do you feel a bit depleted? And for me, I can quite enjoy being around people, but then I need to have some alone time to just kind of charge my batteries. So that hasn't changed. What has changed is that I used to be very, very shy. Throughout university, I was, for example, super talkative with my closest friends. But then in many other occasions, I could be very, very quiet. I felt that I basically didn't have anything to add to the conversation. So then you might just as well, not say anything. There's a lot of talk in the world already. But then I think it was especially as a researcher when I became quite confident that I actually knew a lot of things about my own domain. Then I became quite a lot more comfortable speaking about that topic because I felt that I actually have something to add to the conversation, and that's adding value to whomever I was engaging with. So that was a big game changer in that sense. And I'm still much more comfortable speaking about, supply chain optimization and retail planning than doing small talk with people. But yeah, then when it comes to cold calling, I don't think it's easy for anyone. I think it's quite interesting experience because you need to kind of confront your own insecurity, which is something that in many situations you can try to avoid. You try to escape it. And now you kind of put yourself in that situation where you know that the most likely outcome is that either nobody will reply or you'll get a rejection. So it's quite something. It's a psychological experiment in some ways. But then on the other hand, I'm always driven by the outcomes. And that's kind of been my tool in being able to do that type of work. And, somebody needs to do it because we need those outcomes. B, I don't see anyone else here that's, available to do it or qualified to do it. So my cold calling journey started for real when we were expanding to Sweden, and my family language is Swedish. So I was like, well, I don't see anyone else here, so better pick up the phone. And then I kind of tackled the stress of the situation by basically just blocking out time. So this is the time I'm going to spend. Successful or not, I'm just going to spend all this time doing this. So discipline. I've always been quite good at discipline, so it kind of helped me here. And then just thinking that, before the call or attempted call, you have nothing. And the worst thing that can happen is that after the call, you still have nothing. So you're basically not losing anything, but there is a big upside that you might actually be able to engage with a person. And if they are like a geeky supply chain person, you might actually hit it off quite well. And even in the end, make friends like I've done with several of our clients.
No, absolutely. There's so many things that resonated. First off, I don't know if introverted was the right word for me, but maybe just being shy and speaking up was tough for me. I would say for me, I didn't get confidence from knowing anything. I still feel like I don't know much, but more so I'm more comfortable saying whatever and then being wrong. I can be wrong about anything and people can educate me more. And then about cold calling, it's absolutely true. Just again, for me, it was in a way the outcome is important, but separating it from it as well, and just putting in that effort. I'm really into cold calling in the sense that it really changed me in a lot of ways. And my advice to anyone out there is should do a little bit of cold calling in your life, even if you don't want to do sales, because it can really impact you like it has me. But I would love to dive deeper about your background and this conversation, but I'm going to have to cut it off here for talking a little bit more about Finland. And for initially, I would like to get your perspectives on strengths of Finland. And this can be from the perspective of being a tech entrepreneur or more generally. What do you like about Finland?
Well, full disclosure, Finland is the only country I've lived in. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a biased view. I worked a lot across the Nordics. I think there's actually quite a lot of similarities in all the Nordic cultures. So very kind of similar values, I'd say. And these are values that we've tried to kind of instill in RELEX as well. So I think Finns typically come from a place of trust. So in many other cultures, you have to earn that trust. Whereas in Finland, we tend to trust people as the kind of starting point. And then you can lose that trust if somebody doesn't behave as you expect. But you kind of start with trust and then you might lose it. Whereas in other cultures, you might need to spend a lot of time to build that trust. And having that trust from the get-go actually makes things faster. So people kind of tend to think that you're coming from a good place, which makes it easier to suggest changes, for example. Whereas if somebody thinks what you're saying is suspicious or you have an agenda or whatever, there's some other things that you're trying to accomplish that what you're saying, it can take quite a long time. So I think that's a huge positive. And I think that's seen across the Nordics in many ways. Then if I pick my favorite Nordic country, I have to say it's actually not Finland, it's Norway. So how I've kind of described my experiences is that Finns are quite, honest and direct for the most part. Swedes are nicer, friendlier, a bit more like open. And then the Norwegians kind of mix the both in a good way. More direct than the Swedes, but also kind of nicer, more friendly than the Finns. Super scientific.
So the question is, why aren't you in Norway right now?
Oh, you've tried a lot of different locations, but for the most of us, where we are born also kind of comes with some ties to that specific location. And of course, my family is in Finland, so that's a very strong tie. And even when I was working for the most part in Scandinavia, I still kind of lived in Helsinki, although I spent less time here than in all those other places, but I still kind of felt like this is where my roots are and where, I'm at home.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And well, I haven't experienced any of the other Nordic countries living there, but so I've heard. It seems at least what I like about Finland in many ways applies across the Nordics. I suppose there's minute differences here and there. For me, sauna is a big one. I think it seems like you can't compare them. Well, of course, not everyone might know that saunas are originally from Finland, and especially, I don't know if there's any North Americans tuning in now, but they pronounce it sauna there, which is just butchering it. So I hope everyone now knows you should pronounce it sauna. But I guess going back to what you said about trust, I've definitely noticed that here, company culture-wise, which is, I suppose, what you talked about. But yeah, just largely speaking, the way I see that is in government and how people perceive politics. And I mean, of course, nothing's perfect to a degree. It's not complete trust, but when I'm comparing to what it's like in North America, it's a very different story, especially when I'm looking at the US. So It's, I mean, I don't have all the answers in what's the perfect political system, but I do see what trust going a long way. But yeah, that's good about trust. So anything else that comes to mind? I guess it could be other things that apply in the Nordics or then just Finland in general about what you like or strengths.
Yeah, of course, it's probably an acquired taste. Everyone speaks about the weather, but I have to say that it's actually quite nice that you do have seasons. So you might not love all of those seasons, but I do think it does add to your life and kind of create a bit of a stronger bond with your surroundings. That you have these different seasons and everything that comes with it. You get maybe a bit more attuned to nature, for example, because there's just a lot of stuff going on all the time. And personally, I live on an island quite near to the sea always. And, even in the worst seasons, slush season, the sea is always beautiful. It's just different. So that's something that you kind of probably learn to appreciate at some point. But it might not be the kind of top item on your agenda, at every phase in your life.
No, I think that rings very true for me across many different points. One is nature, which is interesting because, let's say, well, North America definitely comes to mind, especially, well, Canada and the US in terms of very beautiful nature. But it's never something I appreciated. Maybe, I don't know if it's being immature or young, but when I came here, I just felt it was closer. Maybe just in Helsinki, how it's so much more accessible. And then I really noticed how it's a great way to recharge. And then about the seasons, I must say, I can say without a doubt, summers in Finland, or I don't know if it's the Nordics, but summers in Finland is the best summers I've ever had anywhere else, which I didn't know. And for context, it's lots of daylight. It's a trade-off between what winter is like, which is the exact opposite. But yes, in the summer, very cool to see in a few weeks where the sun won't even go down for midsummer. But like you said, an acquired taste. Yes, the darkness of winter was definitely an acquired taste for me. So I've been here just under 3 years now, and my first 2 winters were horrible. I think also combined with COVID social restrictions there, though, as I've become a lot more social. But yeah, more recently, I'm appreciating that transition. And I don't want to talk too much, but one thing that I've done personally is dipping in the sea during the winter. That's been something I've really appreciated here, to the point where now it's too warm for me to dip. So a little bit unfortunate. Are you doing any winter routines or anything?
No, oh my God. That's definitely not my thing. I have to say that, even in summer, I feel that the sea is too cold for me. But, we're all different. My routine is actually something I discovered at the start of the pandemic. So, I have elderly relatives, so I didn't want to expose them to any risk, but also, see them. So I try to, isolate pretty well. So didn't go to the gym, things like that. At some point, they were also closed and whatnot. So then I felt like I'm really not good at exercising at home. It's just really difficult to get myself to do it. But what I can do is walk during meetings. And I developed this walking meeting habit really early on. And now it's at such a point that I become really restless if I don't get out walking for at least an hour a day. And most days it's more like 3 hours. So I think that really helps with focusing on what's actually being said. And it's also, I think, good for thinking. And then, of course, physically, it's super good to get away from your laptop and your kind of hunched over position that you typically end up in.
That's actually something I haven't thought about. It's could be very relevant for me because at least when I do phone calls with people, I'm always walking around. I'm also restless, but I suppose I never thought that that's something you could do for meetings. I think my typical thing would be on a video call, but yeah, something I could consider for sure. It's seems very appealing. And anything else that comes to mind about Finland? So we got trust, we got nature with how that maybe with through seasons, how you appreciate nature more. And maybe we can shift more now to specifically being a tech entrepreneur or in the startup ecosystem. I know you haven't maybe experienced necessarily everywhere else, but anything that you've seen in that context.
Yeah, so one thing I'd like to highlight to people who are kind of considering maybe starting their own business, it's surprisingly easy to do all that paperwork that's required. There's some paperwork, yes, but there's also like super clear instructions. And my experience with, for example, taxes is that they're super helpful. They want you to, be able to do things right. And if you don't understand what you're supposed to do, if you just call them, they'll give you plenty of information and even, look things up for you. So I do think as we're a society built on rules and regulations, but then there's also help available to kind of follow those rules and regulations. And when you follow them, things kind of work out. So I'd say it's in some ways actually surprisingly easy to get started. So that shouldn't be like a stumbling stone for anyone who is considering doing their own thing.
No, sure. I mean, I might disagree with you on aspects of that, and we can talk about that a bit more when we're focusing on areas of improvement from my perspective. But generally what you said, I would agree with in terms of, especially the tax office. I think they must be one of the most effective government agencies in Finland because they want to get their tax money as well as soon as you can. So that hasn't necessarily been my experience with every government agency, and that's maybe where being an international person or immigrant comes in. But I think, like you said as well, rules and regulations. I think I don't know if it's unique to Finland in your experience, or maybe just the Nordics in general, that things are super structured and is compared to a lot of other cultures I've lived. I mean, my biggest comparison point is India, where I'm originally from, which is the opposite of structure and rules. It's just chaos, and somehow it works there, but I do appreciate how structure and rules work here. I think there is I don't know if downside's the right word, but I think some instances there could be a bit more flexibility depending on the situation, but definitely prefer rules and structure over anything else.
Yeah, I would imagine if you happen to be some kind of corner case that you don't quite fit in any of the kind of pre-assigned boxes, then flexibility really isn't the strong side of the different governmental agencies. And yes, I would assume that it's a bit trickier if you're an international person, and yes. I agree that there's a lot of work still to be done on that front.
Yeah, but something we can talk about in a bit if you have context with that. But then one thing I was curious about, I mean, I presented my perspective a little bit about Finland versus the Nordics. Well, besides Norway being the perfect blend between Sweden and Finland, is there anything else besides sauna that you would like with Finland? I guess nature is one thing potentially, but anything else you like with Finland over the other Nordic countries?
there's something to be said about Finnish humor. I don't know how to put it because it's kind of quirky in many ways, and it's really hard to describe. And of course, it might also be, an acquired taste. So if you kind of live with it, then you appreciate it. And then from an outsider perspective, it might look just, silly or brutal or whatever. But there's a lot of kind of, in a way, dark humor, but not meant to be dark in that sense, that you need to kind of appreciate where it's coming from. And I think that kind of resonates with me quite a lot.
Sure. I think I can see it as well, but like you said, it's very hard to describe unless you experience it and hear it. But it did make me think of one thing, which is maybe the social dynamics in Finland. And I guess it's a nice segue because I see maybe certain pros to it and certain cons, or I don't know if it's pros and cons, but very different from other cultures. So maybe if I'm talking about my experience, especially compared to North America, I like this analogy I've always told people is that Finland has a coconut culture and North America has a peach culture. And I don't know if you've heard that, but a coconut's hard on the outside, but soft on the inside. And a peach is soft on the outside and hard on the inside. So from what I found, small talk and, meeting strangers, super friendly in North America. But it might be a lot harder to really get close with people. And I think it's the opposite in Finland, where, I think there's a stereotype with some truth to it that Finnish people are a bit cold and maybe strangers don't interact so much. But if you have the opportunity, then it's then you can dive a lot deeper and form more meaningful relationships. Could you maybe speak to that based on your experiences abroad and how you compare cultures?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that observation. Then, of course, I think it's, we speak about different countries and cultures and so on. It's always like borderline stereotypical because in essence, the differences between individuals are always larger than differences between different cultures or companies or countries or whatever. But I do think that Finns are a bit hesitant to, when you meet a new person, and it doesn't come from a bad place. I think we were quite concerned about, not bothering others. I think that's kind of a key value, that you shouldn't bother others. You do your thing and you don't bother anyone else. So it can be a bit hard to kind of even see that it would be welcome if you made more of an effort to include someone, because you don't want to be pushy or you don't want to, force yourself on someone. Maybe they're busy. I don't know. I don't want to invite them. What happens if they feel obliged to come if I invite them? So I first need to kind of fish out if they would be open to the idea of maybe joining our party before I throw around invitations, because that could put them in an awkward position. And, Finns are not always really good at saying no either, because we want to be polite. So then we think from our own perspective that, it could be quite awkward if I ask them and they don't want to, and then they say yes, and then we're all there and it's awkward. So we really don't like awkward.
Yeah. No, I think what you boil it down to, and I guess I've never thought about this, is Finnish people have a lot of empathy and they put themselves in other people's shoes. And then maybe in general, of course, it's stereotyping. There'd be a cultural mismatch. But one thing I could touch on in my experience is that if you make the first move, which I'm very comfortable doing now in the sense opening conversations, sales helped a lot with that. Then in my experience, Finnish people, even strangers, are very receptive. It's just about making that first move. And this is more with strangers. I've been fortunate in being in very international areas, so startup ecosystem, and studying in Hanken, a Swedish-speaking university that has an international master's program. So everyone's very inclusive there. But then speaking to strangers, well, I have these hacks to how to start conversations with Finnish people. Number one, if you have a dog or you can approach people with dogs, I think Finnish people appreciate dogs more than people, potentially. I don't know. But yeah, I think
it boils down to you being able to trust that the dog will actually welcome your suggestions.
Yeah.
So basically your approach, whereas the human might not. So then you can speak to the dog and see if the human is kind of game.
yeah. It's a little bit of emotional intelligence where I might make eye contact and then smile, and we'll see if I get a smile back and then do that accordingly. But I don't have a dog, but I've dog sitted, and that's the only time I've had a lot of Finnish people approach me and start conversations. I don't think this is controversial. I can appreciate a dog more than a person sometimes. They're almost always more friendly, I would say. But yes, I think that's enough about positive things about Finland. And now diving towards the last little bit of this episode, talking about areas of improvement. I think we already touched upon some things that we could go into, but I'll let you take the conversation wherever you'd like in terms of what you'd like to change or where you think Finland needs to go in the future.
I think it's quite clear how Finland has been kind of a closed society, not, through law and regulation, but culturally, probably a bit due to the language and kind of being on the kind of edge of Europe in some sense and whatnot. But we haven't traditionally had a lot of immigration, which means that as a society, we still have a long way to go to be, truly good at welcoming international talent and people with different backgrounds and so on. I think we're still kind of getting used to what other things is the kind of normal world. Mm-hmm. And it's for a reason. It's not that Finns are bad people, but you need a certain amount of exposure to change your thinking. And I think that process is it's just started in Finland, so we still have a long way to go. But we also need to make improvements fast, because I think it's quite evident that the world is in many ways becoming smaller and smaller, and it doesn't make sense for us to kind of isolate on the edge of Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I could talk about personally, not as much, because I think I've had a really positive experience, and I've been posting a lot on LinkedIn about my positive experiences, and that's actually when I came to learn a little bit more about other people's experiences that haven't been so positive. And maybe a few things that have made it easier for me is coming here as a master's student. Studying here is much easier than having studies abroad. I think that's something that's holding Finland back a bit, is how much Finnish education and work experience is valued more than experience in education abroad. But that was in my favor. Also finding myself in the startup ecosystem, which was not planned. It was just kind of random through a dog, actually, how that first job came about. And so I've been in, I think that's been my experience, and I'd imagine that's what RELEX is like as well. That's, as I've heard, a very international company, not only in presence, but also with people in Finland. So something maybe you've cracked and startups have to do, but maybe not necessarily other smaller Finnish companies that are just focused on Finland. So I guess my question would be, is that something you had to deal with at the start? I'd imagine you started as mostly Finnish people, probably speaking in Finnish. Is that the case? And if so, was it tough, or how did that transition go?
Yeah, I think we kind of from day one decided that we'll do all documentation in English. Mm. Who knows, maybe it helps that we have had, out of 3 co-founders, we have 2 that are bilingual. So for me, Swedish has always been the first language, and Finnish the second one. So maybe that kind of shakes the mold up a bit. But then I think we had our first English-speaking employee like super early on. I think we were, just a bit more than a handful of people when the first native English speaker joined. And that didn't feel like a change. It was, just supernatural. And then we've added on more people. I think the big change is that when you have a bit of a kind of critical mass, it's just a lot easier for others then to join, because then it's much less of that thing that you have a lunch, table with 10 people, and then one is, for example, English speaking. And then, you have one end of the table speaking one language, and then the other speaking maybe English, and then at some point everyone speak Finnish, and so on. So when you have more international talent, it's easier to add more international talent. So today I don't have a number, but we have so many different nationalities just in Helsinki in the head office that it's kind of mind-boggling. And I think it's been like a huge recruitment asset for us that we have, English as the corporate language. So we can actually kind of have an edge when looking for talent, because we don't have these requirements that you need to speak, any level of Finnish if you're not in a specific role that requires it, but there are very few of those. So I see it as a huge advantage for us. And then of course it's easier to have a nice work life when there's other international talent, and you don't need to feel like, oh, I'm the only English speaker here again, and now everyone's switching to English just because of me, and so on. Everything just becomes more natural. So it actually happens quite often, because we've grown quite a lot over the years. So I don't know everyone at the office anymore. So if there's a new person, I tend to start in English, because who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of points I could dive deeper. Actually, just speaking to RELEX, I guess you mentioned being bilingual was one factor, but did you already know when you started that you'd want to go international, or was that something that didn't come to mind yet as far as RELEX's business operation?
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't think the plan was all that detailed. But then when starting RELEX, we already knew that this was a global problem. So we started with automating store forecasting and replenishment. And one of the things I had done as a researcher was to lead a research effort looking at different European retailers, so big ones, leading ones. And that really kind of solidified the view that we've been working with Finnish companies doing the research, and the problems we found were such that no one of these big companies had solved them. So we kind of saw that there was potential. It wasn't like Finland is a kind of backwaters of retail that don't know what they're doing. It was the opposite. Many Finnish retailers were ahead of other European retailers. So that did give us confidence that if we can solve this here, we can solve it in other places as well. So I do think there was like an implicit thinking that this will go international, but there wasn't like an exact plan on how to do that.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is something that I see as a solution for non-startups or non-international companies. Of course, it's easier for them when it's a given that you would need international people as part of your operations. But for companies that are just operating in Finland or then haven't had any international people, there's this barrier. What's this incentive to go international, change things up? I would like to say, with no context, but if I were to consult Finnish companies, I would say become more ambitious. Try to go international. Maybe it doesn't make sense in all contexts, but this is something that I would see as just being helpful to make that push. Because otherwise, why would you, in a way, if there's or it's hard to say. I would just do it for maybe for diversity. Of course, there's the values of that, but I think it's easier when you can also say there's a business reason as well. Just a thought that came up. And then something else that you touched on is that critical mass of people coming in. And, well, you started off with everything being set up in English, so it was also an easy transition. So that's something I see with companies, but maybe just Finland overall, where I see there's, from my perspective, a trade-off with language and maybe preservation of Finnish language and Finnish culture, and then maybe the advancement of, let's say, the company itself from a business perspective, or then Finland from an economy perspective. Like, how much can you grow when you make English more and more as a part of the language? And I don't know if you'd agree with that or disagree. Curious to get that perspective. But then also, where do you think is the right place to draw the line? Because I think both areas are important.
Yeah, I have to say that, in my previous career, I did research. It all happened in English. There was basically nothing in Finnish. Maybe I gave a lecture or two in Finnish, but pretty much everything was done in English. All the literature, all the articles, it was just a kind of shared language of research anyhow. So I think for many people, it's actually easier, in knowledge intense environments to just use English, because the kind of vocabulary, everything is there. It's tends to be a bit of a struggle to, for example, speak about, supply chain and retail planning in Finnish or in Swedish, because you just don't have all those words that you need. You tend to start inventing your own stuff, or then you have this one sentence replacing one English word. It just gets quite cumbersome. So I do think that we're already on that path. So it's not like, do I opt out somehow, or, it's already happening. Then I think it's a whole other conversation on preserving these smaller languages and cultures and so on. But I do not think that it's on the shoulders of companies to do that.
So would you say, in your experience, let's say with research, I think this is something I've heard from one person, is that to a fault then, when everything is done in English? Would you like to see stuff being done more in Finnish, or not necessarily? Do you see in any capacity that there's an issue of Finnish not being preserved enough in Finland?
Let's say that I understand and appreciate the argument that people make that we need to preserve. But then from a personal perspective, I don't see that as a huge worry. Maybe, a bilingual background already kind of adjusts you to the fact that you're going to use different languages in different contexts. And that doesn't mean that one language is somehow more valuable or important than the other one. So, for me, it's not a huge issue. But on the other hand, I as said, I can see where the other argument is coming from.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic, I wouldn't say this is a con, but something I like to bring up about Finland, and maybe not many people know outside of Finland or the Nordics, but Swedish is a official language of Finland, and there's a 5% minority. I had no idea, at least before I came to Finland, and Now, I study at a Swedish-speaking university, so a lot of my circles are Swedish-speaking Finns. And where do you see that, the role of language preservation with Swedish and Finnish? Because I do see a shift to where Finland and Helsinki, especially becoming more and more English friendly. But where do you see the role of also the Swedish language? And is there something to be done about preserving that? Or if you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. And of course, Swedish is quite regional in Finland, so that, whatever 5% or something is not spread equally across the country. It's very much kind of focused on certain regions where the percentage is then higher. So in, for example, Ostrobothnia, we do have areas where Swedish is still the dominant language. So the kind of majority of the population in certain areas do speak Swedish. And I think it does add value that you can, for example, deal with the government in Swedish. But I don't think this takes away from offering services in English. Then does it make sense to have the whole population learn Swedish in school? I think the results kind of speak for themselves. People do not learn Swedish in school if they are not motivated. Then do I myself appreciate that my child can go to a Swedish-speaking school? Yes. And that's basically based on that, now we're going into like really nitty-gritty detail, but Finnish is really easy to write when you can, speak it properly, because you write it exactly as you speak it. Whereas Swedish is like English, that you pronounce words and then you write them completely differently. And then you just need to know that this is how it's done. So if you want to offer that opportunity to, for example, Swedish-speaking children, that they'll be able to write well in Swedish, we need to preserve the schools. But as said, not perhaps force everyone to spend some of their high school years struggling with Swedish, especially in areas where they get zero exposure to Swedish. But from my own perspective, Swedish has been super helpful. That's how we got started in Sweden, how we got started in Norway. It's been immensely valuable to be able to not just kind of do transactional business, but really kind of create those relationships and be able to engage with very, for example, local retailers that may not be that comfortable speaking English, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I consider myself, because I would say I want to stay in Finland long term and go for Finnish citizenship, and my angle for that will be Swedish. On one hand, Swedish being a lot more similar to English, so it seems easier to tackle. And then, like you talked about, just the number of speakers, so the utility there is from learning Finnish. Of course, I still want to learn Finnish, but more to have small talk in the sauna, or then make it a lower barrier to talk to people with dogs. But yeah, no, it's a good point, and very nuanced, of course. And I would say I would agree with you, also based on my personal experience, where when I was forced to learn a language, it did not go well, and I didn't in school, and I didn't learn that language. And I think there needs to be some intrinsic motivation to do that.
The good news is that there's a lot of development on that front, learning languages. So all in all, I would encourage people to take advantage of whatever is offered in school, in university or whatever. So think about it. You may not realize when you're still in school, but you're actually getting a lot of valuable tuition for free, basically. So I would just tell everyone to kind of max out on that benefit. It's super useful to do those, even if you take, I ran out of French. I did French in school and then at university. And then there wasn't any classes anymore because it's not, it's not a key thing for a technical university to offer. So then I switched to doing German just for fun because, for free, you can learn things. And, that combined with Swedish actually enables me to read and understand stuff in German. So I can, for example, flip through my German colleagues' slide decks and understand the content. Not saying that I would be able to put that content together myself, but it's already super valuable to just be able to grasp things. And now with all these language apps and whatnot, it's so much easier to kind of pick up a language. So I hope this will change how we teach languages in schools. But B, I would really encourage people to, try to pick up as much as you can, because it can be super valuable. And that's something we've utilized, especially, well, still now, but especially when we started RELEX and, we were entering the German market. It was so valuable that we had people who knew German, who spoke it fluently, that had kind of grown up in headquarters, knew everything about our product, everything about our offering, and could then go to Germany and start up our business there. And that was just, based on having that language knowledge, super valuable.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree. It's one of my regrets not taking advantage of language. And something you'll touch on, which is maybe I'd highlight, which is not the case everywhere, is to take advantage of the education in Finland. It is free. So that is not the case everywhere, of course. So that's one strength I would highlight that I haven't experienced myself here. Well, now I study for free with my master's, but I would say we're just around time. But if you would have one last quick thing to say about an area of improvement or something you don't like in a minute or two, or we can wrap it up here.
Yeah,
Either way.
I feel bad about, highlighting the downside, but yeah, I think you kind of touched upon it. So I think we've been pretty good at attracting international talent to do studies in Finland. But then there's a bit of a hurdle on the next step, because then you need to secure employment. And then, to be employed, you need to have work permits. So I think we could just, have some kind of support for that transition period when you graduate, you finalize your studies, till you secure that, real next job. So that you don't have that kind of moment of discontinuation where people start worrying about their future and maybe looking at other countries. So it feels like we do invest quite a bit in the kind of studies part, but then we are not as great at taking care of people who have already kind of invested time and effort in Finland to get them to stay on and make it easy and kind of natural to just stay on. So I think, still rely too much on people finding, partners in Finland and being locked down that way.
Yeah, that's a common story, and I think that speaks to some of the bureaucratic angles, let's say with immigration. And of course, it just doesn't make sense to invest in people's education and then have them leave. And oftentimes when they would want to stay, I think this is a common misconception that a lot of people want to get the free education and leave. There was some study around this that I think around 50% of students that would want to stay end up leaving. So 100% agree there. And yeah, I think when you say you feel bad about highlighting bad things, I think it is important to paint an authentic picture. And for example, for myself, there's so many things I like. I mean, all the pros for me outweigh the cons. But then again, for example, that I think it's important for international people that are coming here to study to know that the labor market is highly dependent on your field. So startups and tech, by all means, come here. That's where I've been working, and it's really open. But of course, dependent on the industry, the language requirements, understandably so, vary. So something to keep in mind. And And then, yeah, just keeping in mind, not just to Finland, but different cultures and see how you might adapt or not. I think I've adapted fairly well, not integrating into becoming not caring too much, or I want to disrupt people. I don't mind. I'm not too empathetic in that sense, but I have talked to some other people from similar cultures that struggle with that. But yes, I think that's enough for this episode. Thank you so much for being here. I don't know if you want to leave any last thoughts with the audience, if you want to shout out anything with RELEX or anything else.
Oh my, there's so much to say. Well, if you have some international talent listening to this podcast, I just want to say welcome. Welcome to Finland. Welcome to RELEX. Welcome to, the startup community in Finland, and welcome to a lot of innovative companies working with, green and clean tech. So I do think that it will require a bit of work, a bit of engagement from you. Mm-hmm. But I also think that there's a lot to gain by looking at this type of adventure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.